If I told you an engine with nearly 4 gallons of oil and Navy spec wet sleeves lost the market war to a dry bore block with head bolts mechanics called junk, you'd call me a liar. But that's exactly what happened in the 70s. Most folks will tell you the John Deere 404 was the gold standard. But if you talk to the men who actually lived under the hood, they'll tell you about a forgotten orange powerhouse. The Allis-Chalmers 3500 was mechanically superior to the Deere 404 in every way that truly matters to a mechanic. It had the better oiling, the better sleeves, and a heritage of industrial grit that the green machines just couldn't match. But technical superiority doesn't always win the day. By the time the dust settled, the better machine lost because the dealers closed their doors. Stick around, because this piece of history explains exactly why we're in the spot we're in today. It's the summer of 1978. If you walk into a local repair shop, the air is thick with the smell of burnt 15W40 and the humid heat of a Midwest July. There's hydraulic fluid staining the concrete floor, a map of every failure that's rolled through the big overhead doors that season. In the center of the bay, 2 tractors are waiting for the wrench. This is where the marketing brochures go to die, and the truth comes out in the form of metal shavings and cracked blocks. My grandfather used to say you don't know a man until you see him under pressure, and you don't know a tractor until you see it at 3,000 hours. He was a third-generation mechanic who learned the trade when steam was still a memory and gasoline was king. By 78, he'd seen the transition to high-horsepower diesel, and he'd developed a keen eye for what he called disposable iron. On the left side of the shop sits a John Deere 4320. It's fresh from the dealer lot, and that green paint is still gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The 404 under the hood is the talk of the county. It's sophisticated, it's quiet, and it's backed by the most powerful dealer network in the world. To a young farmer looking at a banknote, that green paint looks like security. It looks like a machine that will never let him down, because the parts counter is only 10 miles away. But then you look in the far corner, parked like an afterthought near the scrap bin. It's an Allis-Chalmers D21 Series 2. The Persian orange paint is faded to a dull peach color from years of sitting out in the Nebraska sun. It doesn't have the fancy lines of the Deere. It looks simple, almost too simple. It's got the 3500 series engine, a 426 cubic inch beast that most people in the next county over have already forgotten about. The mechanic's bias in those days was usually dictated by the color of his toolbox. But my grandfather was different. He trusted what he could fix with basic hand tools. He'd heard the stories about the Deere 404s throwing rods in heavy clay, and he'd heard the legends of the Allis engines running 20,000 hours without ever having the head pulled. He'd seen the Deere tractors come in for preventative overhauls at 1,800 hours, while the Allis tractors only showed up when the tires were bald or the operator finally retired. To the casual observer, the Deere was the future. It had the sleek cab and the smooth power shift. The Allis looked like a relic of a different era, a piece of industrial equipment that happened to have a seat bolted to it. But when you started pulling the side panels off, the narrative began to shift. You started to see where the corners were cut for the sake of the assembly line, and where the iron was poured extra thick just because it was the right way to do it. The Deere 404 came from a company that understood the farmer's desire for comfort and reliability, or at least the appearance of it. The Allis 3500 came from a company still building engines for locomotives and Navy generators. The Deere was designed to satisfy a quarterly earnings report. The Allis was designed to satisfy a bolt. Before he even turned a wrench on that 4320, my grandfather knew what he was going to find. He knew the tolerances were tight, the oil capacity was low, and the metallurgy was just good enough. Then he'd look over at that old D21 and smile. He knew that under that faded orange hood lay a secret powerhouse that the rest of the world was about to trade in for a shiny green lie. To understand why that iron failed, or why it endured, you have to look under the hood and see what they were actually thinking in the design room. Because before the first bolt is turned, the fate of the farm is already decided by the engineers. When you lay these 2 blocks side by side on the workbench, you aren't just looking at iron. The Allis-Chalmers 3500 is a 426 cubic inch brute. It's got a 5-inch stroke that provides a kind of low-end torque that feels like it's trying to rotate the earth under the tires. But the real magic isn't in the displacement, it's in the architecture. This engine was born from the 1953 acquisition of the Buda Engine Company. Buda didn't build for seasonal use. They built for the Navy. They built for rock crushers. They built for things that weren't allowed to stop. The 3,500 uses a wet sleeve design. Now, for the folks who haven't spent their Saturdays covered in grease, here's why that matters. A wet sleeve means the cooling jacket is in direct contact with the cylinder liner. The heat transfer is immediate and efficient. If you overheat that engine, the sleeve expands uniformly. More importantly, when it comes time to rebuild, you pull the old sleeves out, drop new ones in, and you've got a brand new factory spec cylinder. It's a design built for a 100-year lifespan. It's simple, it's rugged, and it's honest. Then you look at the John Deere 404. It's a parent metal bore engine. That means the cylinders are bored directly into the heavy engine block casting. No sleeves. If you score a cylinder wall on a 404 because a ring snapped or a piece of carbon got loose, you aren't just swapping a liner. You are taking that entire block to a machine shop to be bored out. It was a design choice made for the assembly line. It's cheaper to manufacture and it's lighter, but it's a nightmare for a man trying to keep a tractor running in a shed with basic tools. It's the difference between a tool you maintain and an appliance you eventually replace. But the technical gap widens when you talk about the lifeblood of the machine, the oil. The Allis 3500 carries a massive 15-quart oil capacity. That's nearly 4 gallons of lubricant circulating through that block. High oil volume means the oil stays cooler, the additives last longer, and the engine can tolerate running lean or dirty for much longer stretches. Allis-Chalmers gave that engine loose tolerances on purpose. It was designed to run in the dust, to run hot, and to keep going even when the maintenance schedule was more of a suggestion than a rule. The Deere 404, by comparison, was notoriously stingy with its oiling. In the early 70s, many of these engines were failing at 1,800 hours. Why? Because the oil capacity was too low for the heat being generated, especially when farmers started turning up the injection pumps to keep up with the neighbors' bigger rigs. In heavy clay plowing, where the engine is under a constant, brutal load for 12 hours at a time, the 404 would suffer from oil starvation. The oil would break down from the heat, the film strength would vanish, and suddenly you've got a seized piston or a spun bearing. Deere's engineers built that engine with tight, automotive-style tolerances. On paper, that makes for a quiet, efficient engine that meets the specs. But the field isn't a lab. In the field, you need slop. You need room for the metal to expand when the Nebraska sun is beating down and the radiator is choked with chaff. The AC 3500 had that room. It was built with the understanding that a farmer might miss an oil change during a wet harvest. It was built to survive neglect. The 404 also had a persistent junk quality to its head bolts. Mechanics from that era will tell you that you never, ever reused Deere head bolts. They'd stretch and snap, leading to head gasket failures that would dump coolant into the oil pan. By the time you noticed the milky sheen on the dipstick, the bearings were already toast. The Allis, meanwhile, used heavy-duty studs and a head design that stayed flat even under extreme thermal cycles. The Deere was a precision instrument that required a perfect environment. The Allis was a sledgehammer. When the work gets truly ugly, you don't reach for the scalpel, you reach for the hammer. The real test isn't here on the concrete, it's in the dirt. To see the truth of these machines, you have to leave the shade of the shop and head out to the Nebraska Panhandle during the peak of the harvest. It's a place where the clay is so thick and stubborn, it feels like you're trying to plow through wet concrete. In the fall of the 70s, farmers were running 24-hour shifts because a rain cloud on the horizon could mean the difference between a paid-off note and a foreclosure. As the clock ticks past the 12-hour mark and the ambient temperature refuses to drop below 90, a farmer is leaning into the steering wheel of his John Deere 4320. At first glance, the machine is a masterpiece of efficiency. The power shift transmission is smooth as silk, allowing him to downshift under load without ever losing momentum. The hydraulics are snappy, holding the heavy plow at a perfect, consistent depth with 2,250 pounds per square inch of precision. From the cab, it feels like the future. The 404 engine is humming a high-pitched, sophisticated tune at 2,250 revolutions per minute. It's impressive. It feels like a thoroughbred. But as the clock ticks past the 12-hour mark, and the ambient temperature refuses to drop below 90, the thoroughbred starts to lather. The farmer notices the oil pressure needle dancing just a hair lower than it was at noon. He pulls the dipstick at the fuel stop and sees the level has dropped a quart in just half a day. The 404 is starting to drink. Then comes the sound, a faint metallic tapping that seasoned ears recognize as piston slap. The tight tolerances that made the engine so quiet in the showroom are now working against it. The heat has expanded the metal beyond its design limits, and the oil film is thinning out until it's almost non-existent. Then, at exactly 1,800 hours on the digital tachometer, the survival counter hits 0. During a 2 a.m. shift, there's a sound like a shotgun blast muffled by a bucket of bolts. The 404 throws a connecting rod straight through the side of the parent metal block. There is no fixing this on the farm. There is no simple sleeve to swap. The oil and coolant dump into the furrow, and the green pride of the county becomes a 3-ton paperweight. The farmer is left standing in the dark, smelling the acrid scent of a dead engine, and realizing that his sophisticated investment just cost him the season. Now, look 3 miles over the fence line. Same Nebraska clay, same brutal heat, same desperate schedule. But the tractor in this furrow is that faded Allis-Chalmers D21. Vibrates in your chest. The turbocharger vibrates in your chest. The turbocharger is whistling a steady, defiant tune as it gulps down air and pushes it into those 426 cubic inches of iron. This Allis doesn't have 1,800 hours on it. It has 12,000. Some of these engines in the valley are pushing 20,000 hours without ever having a mechanic touch a head bolt. The farmer doesn't worry about the oil pressure because he knows there's a massive oil reserve circulating through those wide-open tolerances. He adjusted the valves to 15 thousandths of an inch back in March, and he hasn't looked at them since. The 3500 doesn't care about the heat. It was designed for the Navy to run in a cramped engine room at full throttle for a month straight. A Nebraska afternoon is just a warm-up. As the sun comes up, the orange tractor is still pulling. It's slow, it's loud, and it's ugly. But the plow is moving. The farmer realizes the cost reality of his situation. While his neighbor is at the dealership signing a $5,000 work order for a new short block and 20 hours of shop labor, he's just pouring in 5 gallons of diesel and greasing the front end. The orange tractor is the one still pulling when the green one is sitting in the scrapyard. The AC 3500 proved it was the tougher iron. Therefore, by all logic of the free market, it should have owned the industry. But the dealers were about to tell a very different story. You can have the strongest heart in the valley, but if your legs give out, you aren't going anywhere. In the world of high-stakes farming, you can't farm what you can't fix, and you can't fix what you can't find. By the mid-70s, the war between the Allis 3500 and the Deere 404 wasn't being decided by torque curves or sleeve designs anymore. It was being decided on the gravel lots of the local dealerships. This is where the mechanical reality of the shop floor collided with the brutal logistics of the real world. To understand why the better engine lost, you have to look at the infrastructure behind the iron. Imagine it's 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The sky is turning a bruised purple, and a storm is rolling in from the west. You're in the middle of harvest, and a simple hydraulic fitting or a specialized head gasket fails. If you own that John Deere 4320, you aren't worried. You hop in the truck and drive 10 miles to the local green dealership. The lights are on, the parts counter is staffed by 3 guys who know your name, and the shelf is stocked with every seal, bolt, and filter that 404 engine could ever need. If the repair is too big for a field fix, they've got a loaner tractor sitting out front, and JD Credit has already pre-approved your signature for the repair bill. That green paint didn't just represent a tractor, it represented a safety net. Deere understood that a farmer isn't just buying a machine, he's buying uptime. They built a network so dense and so efficient that they could afford to have an engine with junk head bolts and parent metal bores. Why? Because they could fix it faster than the competition could find the parts. The Deere network was a well-oiled machine that turned mechanical vulnerability into a service opportunity. They let the other guys do the radical R&D while they perfected the art of the parts run. Now, look at the man running the Allis-Chalmers. He's got the superior 3,500 engine. He's got the wet sleeves and the 15-quart oil pan. But when his water pump weep hole starts leaking at 5 p.m. on a Friday, his heart sinks. Get through. He finds out the water pump is on back order from the Harvey plant. Allis-Chalmers was a company of brilliant engineers, but their dealer coverage was becoming a patchwork of shuttered windows and empty lots. This created a trade-in trap that eventually strangled the Orange brand. When a farmer went to the bank to finance his next tractor, the loan officer looked at the resale value. A used John Deere was like gold. It held its value because everyone knew they could get parts for it. A used Allis-Chalmers was a gamble. It depreciated the moment it left the lot because the company's future looked shaky. Even if a farmer knew the 3,500 was the better engine, he couldn't afford the hit he'd take on the back end. He was forced to buy the worse machine because it was the better financial instrument. The marketing machine at Deere was relentless too. They didn't talk about wet sleeves or oil capacity. They talked about the long green line. They sold the idea of family legacy and the prestige of the neighborhood. Allis-Chalmers tried to counter with technical innovation, but they lacked the credit arms and the aggressive dealer timing to make it stick. While Allis was building the perfect engine, Deere was building the perfect ecosystem. The mechanic's observation from those years was heartbreakingly simple. He'd see a neighbor's Deere break down, and that neighbor would come over to borrow the old Allis to finish his field. But when that Allis finally needed a head gasket after 10 years of abuse, that same farmer would be sitting idle for 3 weeks waiting on a shipping crate. The best iron in the world doesn't matter one bit if the company behind it is bleeding out. Reliability is a hollow victory when the support system vanishes. Therefore, the Orange engine's fate was sealed by a balance sheet it never had the chance to outrun. By the early 1980s, the mechanical debate between the 3,500 and the 404 was being silenced by the cold, hard reality of a global economic collapse. The farm crisis wasn't just a downturn, it was a reckoning for every manufacturer that had overextended itself during the boom years of the 70s. Allis-Chalmers, despite having some of the finest engineering minds in the world, was a company drowning in its own diversity. While John Deere had remained laser-focused on the dirt, Allis-Chalmers had tried to be everything to everyone. They were building massive electrical turbines, heavy construction equipment through the Fiat Allis venture, and experimental energy systems like the kiln gas project. They were spread so thin that the agricultural division, the heart of the company, began to starve for capital. In 1984, the financial dam finally broke. Allis-Chalmers reported a staggering loss of $28.8 million. To a mechanic on the shop floor, that number was abstract, but the consequences were concrete. R&D for the next generation of engines slowed to a crawl. The legendary Harvey plant, where the 3,500 series was born, saw its production lines go quiet. The company was bleeding out, and the vultures were starting to circle. In May of 1985, the unthinkable happened. The storied agricultural division of Allis-Chalmers was sold to Klockner Humboldt Deutz of Germany for a mere $107 million. To put that in perspective, that was less than half the division's actual book value. It was a fire sale of a century of American innovation. The irony of this sale was a bitter pill for the Orange faithful to swallow. While the corporation was dying, the engines themselves were just getting started. The 3,500 series engines were outliving the very entity that created them. You had tractors from the 60s and 70s still pulling record yields, their wet sleeves and 15-quart oil pans proving their worth every single day, while the executives in Milwaukee were signing away the blueprints. This is the dark truth of the industrial age. Sometimes the best engineering loses to the best balance sheet. Mechanical reliability is a long-term play, but the stock market only cares about the next 90 days. John Deere won that war not because the 404 was a better engine, history has proven it wasn't, but because Deere was a better business. They were conservative. They didn't chase every shiny new technology. They let Allis-Chalmers and International Harvester take the risks and suffer the bleeding-edge failures. Then they moved in with a refined, supported version of what worked. They understood that the farmer's loyalty wasn't just to the iron, but to the stability of the name on the hood. When Alice was sold to Deutz, that sense of stability vanished overnight. The orange soul was effectively gone, leaving behind a legacy of what could have been if the money men had possessed half the integrity of the mechanics. The aftermath was a slow dissolution. AGCO eventually inherited the bones of the Allis-Chalmers line, but the unique DNA of the Buddha-descended 3500 was phased out in favor of more modern, emissions-compliant designs. The 3500 didn't die because it failed. It died because it was too honest for a world moving toward planned obsolescence. When Allis-Chalmers sold to Deutz, the orange soul was effectively gone, leaving behind a legacy of what could have been if the money men had possessed half the integrity of the mechanics. Today, if you go looking for the legacy of the Allis-Chalmers 3500, you won't find it in a corporate headquarters or a glossy new showroom. You have to go to the back of the barns, to the small-town auctions, and to the hands of the legacy stewards who still know what real iron feels like. You'll find these engines in the Nebraska Panhandle, still powering irrigation pumps or pulling a grain cart when the modern tractors are in the shop for a sensor failure. These 3005s are the survivors. They are the mechanical testament to a time when we built things to outlast our own lifetimes. There is a growing split in the vintage tractor world. You have the collectors who want museum pieces, tractors with perfect Persian orange paint that never see a day of work. But then you have the working collectors. These are the men who buy an old D21 or an 8000 series specifically because they know that 426 cubic inch heart is indestructible. They measure worth in hours, not in resale value. They know that a tractor that can run 20,000 hours without an overhaul is the best hedge against an uncertain future. To them, the simplicity of the 3500 isn't a relic, it's an advantage. The lesson for us today is one of engineering purity versus market reality. We live in an era of extreme complexity, where a single computer chip can brick a $100,000 machine. Looking back at the 3500 reminds us that there is a different way to build. You can build for the long haul. You can build with tolerances that allow for human error and environmental brutality. You can build something that a man can fix with his own two hands in his own shed. That kind of freedom is what the Allis-Chalmers 3500 truly offered. John Deere might have won the market, and their green paint might dominate the horizon, but the orange tractors still have the last word. Every time one of those old 3500s fires up on a sub-zero morning without a struggle, it's a victory for the engineers at the Harvey plant. It's a reminder that while you can't fix a bankrupt company, you can always fix simple, honest iron. The 3500 remains the forgotten king of the furrow, a secret powerhouse that proved reliability is a legacy that no boardroom can ever truly sell off. My grandfather was right all those years ago in that hot July shop. The green paint was the safe bet, but the orange iron was the truth. You can fix simple, you can't fix gone. And as long as there's a 3500 still whistling in the field, the spirit of Allis-Chalmers isn't gone. It's just waiting for the next man who values grit over glamour to climb into the seat and put it back to work. Was it better to build the perfect engine or the perfect company? History chose the balance sheet, but the iron remembers the truth. If you believe the old ways of fixing things are worth saving, subscribe. Let's keep this history running. This is Rust and Roots. See you afield.